So, the three speakers we have today, in their speaking order, will be Professor Tony Lawson, newly elected, who's the head of the Cambridge Social Ontology Group, as well as the Cambridge Realist Group. He's also looks into economics as a social theory, and studies the nature and state of modern economics, as is his new book. Afterwards, Professor Hamish Lowe will talk about, as well as the topic, in terms of his view, as a research fellow for the Institute for Fiscal Studies, as well as a professor of economics and the director of research and strategy at Cambridge. And then finally, Dr. Hajun Chang, who's written books such as The Bad Samaritans, 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism, as well as Economics, the User's Guide, who studies in terms of the alternate approaches to economics. And so the hope is, with a varied panel, we'll have a varied discussion, and also students to join in and give their views. So before we begin... Sorry. Wonderful. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Tony Lawson to begin.
Thank you. If I'm sitting down, can you hear me at the back?
I can't see you, but we can.
Yeah, I couldn't hear that. Did you say yes? Okay. Can economics become a science? That's the question. Traditionally, well, first of all, it's not unhelpful to divide up economics into those who can be called the mainstream and others who self-identify as heterodoxy economists. I'd like to say they criticize each other. Actually, the mainstream tend to ignore the heterodoxy, and the heterodoxy criticize the mainstream. But the two groups, traditionally, by and large, have taken given a different answer to this question. Not uniformly, but mainstream economists have tended to say, yes, economics can be a science. Heterodoxy, or significant sections of heterodoxy, have said, no, economics cannot be a science. I think both groups are wrong. Both groups are wrong because they share a common false assumption. That false assumption is about the nature of science. When one group says, yes, economics can be a science, they have the wrong conception of science. When the other group denies it, they share the same common conception of science. That conception of science is basically that science is about correlations and predictions. If you think science is about getting correlations, predicting, it clearly underpins, supports the emphasis on mathematical modelling, which is basically what the mainstream does. And lots of people in heterodoxy think that mathematical modelling is impossible, therefore economics can't be a science. I believe economics can be a science, but science has got nothing to do with mathematical modelling, correlation, and prediction. So heterodoxy are wrong for the right reasons, and mainstream are right for the wrong reasons. So what do I think science is? If there is something that's essential to science, and of course science is very complicated, but if there's something that's essential to it, it's causal explanation. It's going from phenomena at one level to a cause at a different level. It's going from sick cows that wobble their heads and fall over to the underlying cause of prion or whatever. It's going from some kind of puzzle phenomenon in whatever domain to the underlying cause. That's not the same as getting correlations and prediction. Now, why do I think that conception is a better conception of what goes on in science? The answer is because it can make sense of all conceptions of science. If we look at event regularities, correlations, prediction, and ask the question, where do they occur? Outside of astronomy, they mostly occur in well-controlled experiments. If I drop a leaf in an experimental vacuum, it falls with a constant rate of acceleration. I get the event regularity. I drop the leaf, it falls with this constant rate of acceleration, a correlation. Now, why does that happen in the experiment and not outside it? It happens because in the experiment we isolate a particular causal mechanism, gravity, curved space, whatever, and isolate it from countervailing forces, from aerodynamic forces, thermodynamic forces, and so on. Now notice, to make sense of the event regularity, I've had to make reference to causal mechanisms. Because even when an event regularity is produced in the experiment, it's produced through identifying an isolated causal mechanism in this case, gravity. It's an empirical identification of the causal mechanism which acts inside and outside the experiment. This glass is not falling with a constant rate of acceleration, but gravity is acting on it, whatever I do with it. We use the knowledge obtained in the experiments, in rockets to the moon, build bridges and so on. Event regularities don't occur outside the experiment, but the causal mechanisms continue to hold. So even to make sense of when event regularities and prediction and mathematics are useful, we have to make reference to causal mechanisms. But they operate inside and outside the experiment. The experiment is a very particular case, even in the non-social natural sciences. It's a very small case, and it's just an aspect of what goes on in the experiment. The real point of the experiment is to identify a causal mechanism. The event regularity is the empirical identification of it. What economists do is take that particular aspect of the experiment and universalize it across everything, including the social realm. They take the wrong feature and universalize it, where the important feature is getting at the causal mechanism. So the question, can economics be a science, is can we do causal analysis in the social realm? And of course we can. We can go from phenomena at one level to causes at a different level. Basic phenomena of social reality are human practices, and the causes are in terms of forms of social structure. For example, social rules. Anthropologists in this room know that people go off to study exotic communities or whatever, observe their practices and infer the rules, the customs, the traditions, or actually the relationships, the institutions or whatever that structure that society. We can do that in the economy. So we start from practices that interest us, bound up with crises, bound up with poverty, oppression of women by men or whatever, and ask what are the structural conditions that make that possible. So we can do science in economics, and we do science in precisely the same sense as natural science, going from the surface phenomena to the underlying causes. I want to say one more thing before I finish. If I'm right, the essential movement is from surface phenomena to underlying causes. That's not deduction or induction, but retroduction. It's a move that you cannot make using mathematics. Deduction, general to particular. I can say all ravens are black and deduce the next one I see will be black. Mathematics can help there. Induction, I can see 6 black ravens and infer all ravens are black. Induction. Mathematics can be useful. Retroduction is to start from the blackness of ravens and say what's the mechanism that causes the blackness. You can't get there by mathematics. Cows wobble their heads and fall over, mad cow's disease. The cause is a prion, a protein that changes shape. You can't get there using mathematics. It takes human creativity. It takes all sorts of ingenuity. Mathematics actually gets in the way of doing science, or the insistence that mathematics is the only way to do things gets in the way of doing science. So to sum up, traditionally there have been 2 approaches, 2 conceptions, or 2 views on can economics be a science. Mainstream said yes, heterodoxy no, but they both share a misconception of science. So mainstream are right for the wrong reasons, heterodoxy wrong for the right reasons. Once we get rid of this idea that science is about correlation and prediction and see that it's getting causal mechanisms, economics can certainly be a science. The main obstacle that stands in the way for achieving the possibility of science is the emphasis on mathematical modelling. So once we get rid of that emphasis and just include it in the toolbox, we don't chuck it up entirely, but include it as one method amongst others, then we can move to a science of economics.
Thank you, Tony. So let me, I really just want to say, I'm going to make 3 main points here, and I think Hunter and Tony might be surprised. In some ways, I don't think we disagree so much about the broad context of what we're saying, but I do think our interpretations are different. I think the kind of main start of the first point I want to make is that this sort of debate about is economics a science, is it not a science, I think is fundamentally the wrong way of even addressing the question. I think the idea of having a debate about is this a science or not a science is not what economics is about. And in fact, more than that, I think is extremely damaging. It leads to polarization of the debate, such as Tony describes, between the heterodox approach or the mainstream approach, and so-called, I think about that sort of polarization, it masks a huge variety, both within the heterodox approach, if you like, but also within the mainstream approach about what the purpose of economics is, what sort of questions we should be asking. But at the heart of it, this is being driven by some people saying, oh, well, yes, economics is a science, we've got to pursue one sort of agenda, or no, economics is not a science, it's a different sort of agenda. I just don't think it's a relevant question. I think the reason it's damaging, I want to give, one reason why I think it's damaging is because among those who, as Tony would describe as being sort of mainstream economists, a belief in it being a science generates a kind of spurious quantification about the effects that can happen. And what I mean by that is, by thinking of it in a scientific sort of a way, a notion scientific sort of way, it means we can generate predictions, if you like, which are then given a very precise answer. And that precision is coming within the context of the framework in which the answers have been come up with. And so I think that we have to be really careful when we're trying to generalize our results. Now, but that kind of desire to have quantification and that desire to be very precise is partly because we're starting from a premise that economics is a science. So I think that kind of first thing is really damaging the way we frame the debate. I think it's very damaging to have this discussion as saying, will economics ever become a science? I just don't want to engage with that discussion at all. That's not what economics is about. Economics is about, and the third thing I'm going to come to is what is economics really about? Okay? But I don't want us to have to get bogged down in this discussion about is it a science or not a science. That's not to say I don't think there are economists out there who believe economics is a science and will pursue it being a science until their final breath. But that's not what I think economics is about. Okay. Second thing I want to talk about is what do we learn from sciences. So this is not saying economics is science, we can be like that. It's saying what are the key principles that I think we take on board from looking at the way natural science progresses and from what other the kind of, if you like, the hard sciences are come up with. The key thing I want to kind of stress is the concept of testable hypotheses. Now, we can debate whether or not those hypotheses are generalizable or not, but one of the kind of key lessons that I've learned from thinking about the way science pursues things is the idea that we can actually test what we are thinking about. We can test our models. Now, we can debate a whole bunch of things about that, but the key issue is if we cannot reject our theories, if we've got no mechanism for rejecting our theories, then we have no mechanism of actually resolving discussions going forward. And so I think fundamentally we need to have some way of testing our hypotheses. Now at the heart of that is, what I'm going to come back to, is that economics is basically an empirical discipline. It's an empirical discipline because it is about explaining what happens in the world. Now if we want to explain what happens in the world, we have to be able to reject hypotheses about our explanations of the world. So that's the kind of heart of what I think we learn from science. Okay. I mean, examples of that are things like what's going to happen if the government decides to increase income tax? That's fundamentally an empirical question. We want to know what will the response be of the individuals in society to that sort of question. Now, there's different ways we can go about answering that question, but it's an empirical question. We're going to make predictions about what's going to happen, and we have to be able to test whether those predictions hold. If we can't test how they hold, then all we're reduced to doing is having a debate in the pub. So what does that kind of lead to? Well, there's two things I want to be very wary of when we think about science or what lessons we can learn from science. The one is, I think we need to be very wary about the generalizability of results. And this kind of chimes a bit with what Tony was saying, is that we draw our conclusions about empirical phenomenon from particular studies and from particular situations. What we have to be careful of is in what circumstances can they be generalized. Now, I kind of see the debate between Esther Duflo and Angus Deaton as at the heart of it is a debate about how generalizable are results. It's about saying we are running some experiment in some particular context, and then we want to infer from that experiment what's going to happen in different contexts. But that is very much about this question of generalizability. How can we generalize what we learn from particular situations? And I think here, I do think there is a value in models. Now, I'm not interested or not discuss, remember I am discussing it, but I'm not really going to engage in this discussion about whether we should be doing models using maths or not using maths. But what a model is a framework for having a discussion about generalizability. A model is a way of thinking, this is the way in which, this is what we observe in the world, this is our way of understanding what we observe in the world, and this is the way we're going to then move towards understanding what might happen in a different situation. So I think models are a key part of our generalizability of our results. Now, that's not to say we can just make up whatever models we want. And I've spent a lot of time saying we cannot use representative agent models. Representative agent models of the economy do not work. We know that, but we still use them. So I think one of the things we need to be doing is taking much more seriously when can we actually generalize our results? What can we actually do moving forward? But I do think models are a key part of that. And what I think is that we should not be restricting the models we build to ones which we can write down and solve analytically. We should be thinking about our model as a framework, as a way of representing what's going on, and that's what we're going to be doing to try and capture the reality we see in the world. Again, a lot of what I do involves computer simulation. And it's computer simulation because I think if we want to capture important bits of reality in what we're saying, we need to write down, we need to be able to show or simulate the effects of different policies. That means often we're not able to write down some nice mathematical expression to capture those results. It does mean, do we have a model in our mind which is going to explain what we see in the world and then what we think going forward is going to happen? Now, of course, we can reject those or test those, but that's the heart of what I think we're doing. So what I think we learn from science is this idea of testable hypothesis, the idea about being very wary of generalizability. And I think generalizability is much harder in social science than it is in science, but those are the kind of key ideas I think we need to sort of be aware of. Third thing I want to talk about is, the last thing I want to talk about is really what is economics? I feel like this debate about what's the kind of heart and soul of what economics is about. I didn't enter into studying economics because I cared about the methodology. I didn't enter it because I wanted to have discussions about should we be modelling things in a mathematical way or non-mathematical way, or what should we be doing. I spent 3 years not knowing any maths at all doing economics. And I think the reason I went into economics is because of the questions that economics was addressing. I think fundamentally we should be starting by saying economics is defined not by whether it's a science, economics is defined by the questions it's addressing. And the key questions, we can discuss what the key questions might be, what we think they are, maybe that's one of the kind of interesting things to discuss. But these are key questions about things like why is there still poverty, both within countries and across countries? Why do we see such governments behaving in the way they're behaving? Why do we see governments trying to expropriate rents from the population? How can we go about trying to affect that? These are the kind of key economic questions which I think are what really drive and define the subject. And I don't think it's about methodology. I think it's about trying to understand answers to those questions. Now, there's a whole range of different ways you can come up with those answers. And I think economics needs to kind of be open to those different ways of addressing those questions. I think even more strongly than that, if I think about the questions of the 20th century, if you like, those were key questions around, if you like, around natural science. Key questions around how progress that physics made, progress in biochemistry, the mapping out the genome. These were the key questions of the 20th century. But where it's left us is in a situation where there's still a lot of aspects of society which do not work. A lot of aspects of the way the world is, with the kind of degrees of inequality, the degrees of poverty, the aspects which do not work. And that's why I think now, as a social science, we should not be saying, look, we want to kind of debate whether we're like a science of last century or not. We should be saying, these are the questions we should be answering, and we want to go out and answer those questions. And we should be doing it in whatever way we can. And that's where I don't want to kind of keep going on about this debate about are we science or not science. It's about focusing on what are the key questions we want to think about. And I think that addressing those questions requires us to be honest that we are often making value judgments in what we do. That we cannot separate out economics from politics. We cannot separate out economics from people's political views. And attempting to do so means we then damage our ability to analyse phenomenon or economic phenomenon. And we damage it because we're in a pretense that we're not actually making value judgments. And I think that for us to move forward, we should start from the questions we're interested in answering. We should be upfront about what value judgments we're making, and we should move from there. And I think that one of the damaging things we can do is by moving into this discussion about being a science or not a science, we are trying to say we can strip out value judgments about things. Okay. So, my kind of key thing I want to kind of you to take away from what I'm saying is that I do believe economics is an empirical subject. It's a subject which is based on what's actually happening out there in the world, in the economy. That's what it's about, and that's what makes it so interesting. It's not a science. It's about understanding social phenomenon. And we should be doing that in a whole range of different ways. But I don't think that means we should not learn from the sciences, learn lessons from the sciences. We should be having these testable hypotheses. We should be thinking about generalizability, taking it seriously. But at the heart of it is an empirical subject. And we should be focusing on what are the interesting questions we should be answering.
Right, well, thank you, Tony, thank you, Hamish, for great comments. Yeah, let me start by kind of raising a couple of issues that come from their comments, and then say a couple of things that are my own. Well, Tony, I don't think that I like this term heterodox. Because it's a relative term. If you are a member of the Greek or Russian Orthodox Church, the Pope is the heterodox guy. Yeah? So, you know, in the former Soviet countries, the Marxists were the Orthodox economists. In the 50s and 60s, in Europe, Keynesians were the Orthodox economists. Yeah? In Korea and Japan, in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, the guys who believe in infant industry theory rather than theory of comparative advantage were the Orthodox economists. Yeah? So I mean, you know, do use it as a shorthand, but I think that we need to really think carefully as to whether there is such a kind of dividing line between neoclassical economics and the rest of economics, because in my view there are, as I tried to argue in my latest book, at least 9 schools and possibly 15, you know, depending on how you divide the bigger schools and so on, which smaller schools you count, so many different schools of economics, which, yeah, leads me to one of my main points, which is that, you know, okay, I mean, that some theories are practiced by more people than others in economics, but unlike in physics or chemistry, no theory has been completely discredited. You know? And of course, people might say, well, you know, the fact that some theories are more practiced doesn't mean that it has had more success and so on. But I don't really think that's the case when it comes to economics, because, for example, in my view, the school that has changed the real world the most are not the neoclassicals, not the Marxists, not the Keynesians, but the school of infant industry argument. This is a policy that from 18th century Britain down to today's China, so many countries that have succeeded in achieving industrial development have used. So, you know, I mean, it's only one aspect, but you know, how theories are selected in economics and social sciences is fundamentally different from how theories are selected in physics, chemistry, and other natural sciences. So that's my first point. Yeah, the second point raised by Hamish, I completely agree with it. You know, there's value judgment everywhere. And I think the reason why we get to talk about this, whether economics is science, is unfortunately, you know, people like Mankiw, you know, Raj Chetty, I mean, they write, you know, writing that economics is science, and therefore we should, you know, I mean, if not completely eliminate value judgment, but try to minimize it, and I think it's driving the subject the wrong way. So, I mean, on that aspect, I completely agree with you. My next point is, you know, I think the difficulty with the social sciences, including economics, is that the objects of investigation have minds of their own. You know, the greatest illustration came from Gary Larson, the American cartoonist who used to draw this one-frame cartoons called The Far Side. And I actually used to have this cartoon on my door, the office door, some years ago. It's a scene where quite a few, well, natives of exotic countries are in grass skirts and all that, running around with TV and you know, the radio and so on. And in the background is a guy shouting, "Anthropologist." Yeah? So that in the back, you see this anthropologist landing from his boat. Yeah? So they have to hide all this TV and modern stuff so that they have to, that they can pretend that they are primitive people untouched by nature. Yeah? Well, I mean, it's not that kind of the joke, but you know, for example, you know, in economic matters, you know, people have their own theories. Yeah? So, for example, there's a big debate on the effect of government industrial policy in East Asian miracle. Yeah? And there were so many conflicting views because you actually go to Japan, go to Korea, and you ask the policymakers, and they say, "Oh, we believe in free market and free enterprise." You know? And then when you watch what they do, I mean, it's completely interventionist. You know? And they were not necessarily lying because they had this cognitive dissonance. Yeah? In the university, they learned that free market is good. Yeah? But then when they are running policy, they realize that they have to do these things to help the Korean firms compete in the world market, Japanese firms defend their turf against American competition or whatever. And they didn't see that contradiction. You know? Also, people have imagination. You know, that suddenly we have big debate on global inequality. You know? I mean, Bugin-Young and Milanovic and Dallo and Craig and all these people. And this really didn't used to be an issue. I mean, the global inequality, for those of you are not familiar with the term, is measuring basically inequality, treating the whole world as if it's one country. Now, this didn't used to matter because people didn't think that the world was one unit. You know? I mean, still, it's mainly national inequality that matters. Huh? You know, you try to go and persuade a Chinese peasant that the rapidly rising inequality in the country is not a problem because the world as a whole is becoming a slightly more equal place. I mean, would he care? I mean, would he stop complaining if you told him that there are much higher levels of inequality in Brazil and South Africa? No. But once you begin to imagine that the whole world is a unit, then it becomes an issue. So basically, what I'm trying to say is that it's not like investigating the physical particles or the chemical compounds or even animals. I mean, human beings have their own worldview, their own imagination, their own values, and this makes it a fundamentally different exercise compared to natural sciences, where you can actually accept that these things are just there and for you to investigate. Okay, so, well, that's all I have to say. I mean, I don't have any more fundamental methodological comments to make, but one last quick comment is, basically, when you have so many different theories, I mean, Hamish said that economics is about questions, and I 99% agree with it, but one qualification is that what questions you ask is affected by the theory you have. So for some people, something is a big question. Class struggle is a big question for the Marxists. For some other people, it's a non-existent phenomenon. So if you're a neoclassical economist, you are more interested in consumers. You're not really interested in what happens in the workplace, because you presume that these people have accepted the going rate of wage because this utility coming from their work is compensated by that wage. But is it really the case? I mean, if you take a more, say, Marxist view, you talk about the influence of work on the people's identity and self-dignity and things like that. So, the questions you ask are not totally independent of the theories you have. So I think that adds another layer of difficulty to this debate. Thank you.
Wonderful. I'd like to thank all the three three speakers for fantastic speeches. I think just before we open it to questions, if there are any responses to the panel, so what did I?
Well, I'll say a couple of things. I almost feel guilty for talking about science, but the question was, can economics be a science, which is why I addressed it, but I'm happy to talk about the things you brought up too. Let me just say a couple of things. I think it's wrong to dismiss the question. I think there's a sense which either economics has to be mathematics, 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 or it's kind of basket weaving. It's common sense, it's trivial, it's not worth bothering with. I think we need to raise our game. Economics used to be a difficult subject, it used to be a deep subject. It's become a trivial subject. And I disagree a lot with Hamish when he says it's empirical. I mean, it's empirical too, but it's much more than empirical. When Hamish says we have to look for generalities, what we universalize of anything, I agree with him. But part of what I'm saying is what we can generalize doesn't lie at the level of the empirical. It's a mistake to look to generalize correlations. Gravity, I mentioned, or curved space, whatever, gets identified in the experiment. It operates on every single autumn leaf all over the world, but the pattern of each leaf is different. It's not the pattern at the level of the leaf that can be generalized. It's the gravity, the aerodynamic forces, the thermodynamic forces. It's the underlying causes that act on them. If we turn to the social realm, we all have different practices, but we live in societies structured by norms, positions, rights, obligations. It's at that deeper level that we can generalize within communities and to some extent across communities. But these features which can generalize are not empirical. The empirical, focusing on the empirical, serves to dumb down the discipline. We spend our time collecting data, looking for correlations, putting it into naughty little computer programs and generating results and calling ourselves, or some people call themselves, scientists. I don't want to give up the word science, I want to give up this mistaken idea of what science is about, but it's much more than empirical. In response to Hajun, I mean, I agree with a lot of what these two say. The point is here, I take it, is to disagree with the things that I want to. I think the word heterodox is useful. Of course it's a relative term. When I talk about the mainstream or the heterodoxy, I usually, certainly in writing, prefix by the word contemporary. But heterodox means rejection of a doctrine held as true. And by and large, throughout modern economics, the doctrine held as true is that mathematical modelling is the way to do economics. Mathematical modelling is the only way to be serious. If you want to get promotion, if you want to publish papers, do it in journals where mathematical modelling dominates. That's a doctrine that is orthodox. To reject that is to be heterodox. But it doesn't mean you're merely passive and rejecting and oppositional. The groups that reject that doctrine include feminist economists, institutional economists, post-Keynesian economists, social economists, Marxian economists, etc. And they've also got, in addition, more positive programs. Get rid of this emphasis on mathematical modelling. We don't need the word mainstream and heterodox. There, I agree with Hajun. But we have to get rid of that emphasis first. And for the time being, it's a useful way of distinguishing. For uniting all these groups, feminists, institutionalists, post-Keynesians, they all are heterodox in the sense that they reject the doctrine that mathematical modelling is the only way to proceed.
A couple of things. One is this issue of mathematical modelling, again, it just serves to polarize a discussion. If you look at what's actually published in economic journals, in top economic journals, the range in how much maths in them and how much formalism in them is from basically none to huge amounts. But you have people able to publish in the top journals regardless of how much maths they're using. Now, there are journals and there are a lot of people take econometric. Articles in econometric, you can see they are fundamentally mathematically focused, 99% of them. But that's not true across the board. And I think one of the movements we see is that this movement of pushing against maths being the problem, I think misses the point, and it plays into the hands of people who want to push this mathematics agenda. I think it plays into hands because it forces this polarization of the debate. Again, the debate should not be polarized like this. I use maths. I'm not ashamed to say I use maths. Sometimes maths is useful. Sometimes it's not. I use quantitative evidence. I use qualitative evidence. You choose the question and you address it the best way you can. And I think if we polarize the discipline and polarize the subject, by focusing on maths versus non-maths, we move people away from focusing on what's actually the important question. So that's my kind of view on maths. This is why when people, it comes up time and time again, and each time I keep trying to say it's not, I don't think it's the right question. I think it's the wrong way to polarize the debate. Actually, one thing about Hadrian, about the questions are and what questions you ask, and how it relates to what models you think. So I think about it slightly differently. I think the questions people choose to ask is defined by their political values, and defined more by what they actually care about, what they're most interested in. And that will then drive everything else. And that's why I think people need to be more honest about how politics and the political views play a role in the answers and the questions they're addressing. Think about the kind of emphasis in, say, during political economy on the market working. That's being driven by people who have got a particular set of value judgments who then address questions which will feed into that set of value judgments. So that's where I think that the questions are being driven by people's political judgments. So that's why I kind of think about defining questions. I still think there's a whole range of different questions and different people can answer those questions. But I think if people are hiding the fact that they're asking questions because they've got particular agendas, I think that's what's particularly damaging.
No, I mean, I once again 99% agree there, but in order to be able to say political values is the only thing that drives the theory of their choice, that we have to be in an environment where people are exposed to all kinds of different theories. But unfortunately they are not, so it's
Yes.
I mean, well,
it is an interesting question. I completely agree that we need more. I completely agree. We need more exposure to what different people are saying about different ways of answering these questions. But I think the starting point we should be saying is, what are the questions we want to ask? And we should not then be constraining ourselves to answer those questions in one particular way.
I mean,
what's damaging is, again, this thing that by trying to answer it in one particular way, it seems being kind of mathematical.
On math, I'm probably closer to you than Tony is, even though I myself do not use any math at all. I think that my view is that economics is basically a political subject. So I'm not having a fundamental disagreement with you on that point that people actually pick theories that fit their political and ethical agenda. But I mean, I think that to make that choice more transparent, I think that we need to help teach the students more different approaches, and only then you will clearly see what political values are driving different people.
Wonderful. Are there any questions?
So, firstly, I'd like to ask how you perceive the distinction between empirics and theory. Because as far as I understand it, empirics can either motivate theory or express a theory. And then I extend that by saying that at least to the ancient Greeks, science was the formation and the study of theory.
So I guess this comes back a bit to what Tony was saying as well about is economics an empirical subject. So let me just start by thinking about that question. So the reason why I call it an empirical subject is because I think what's really important is we move away from, if you like, armchair economics. Or the economics of sitting in the pub having a discussion with your friends over beer about what you think the right theory is of the world. Now, that's a kind of characterization. You could say this is economics just about what it's about. But the reason why I say it's empirical is because everything we say should be grounded in what we actually observe happening. And if it's not grounded in what we observe happening, what's the counterfaction to that? What's the alternative? If it's not grounded in what's happening, it means we're just saying what we want to say.
But
And that's why I kind of think is why I think there's empirical.
I mean, my question goes as far as the methodology of empirics goes. So, for example, statistical theory and all this, it's an armchair discussion. It's people who sat and discussed about what methodology they would pursue to see this world. We see increasingly in econometrics, we use both statistics and economic theory to motivate our questions. So how can we distinguish the empiric, the methodology of the empirics, from the theory that often underlies it?
One last thing now, I'll be quiet. So I think that it's true that a lot of econometrics is done in the kind of in an abstract way. And I think when we're looking at econometrics, we should say that econometrics has got value is if it helps us understanding the way the world is, helps us to understand what the data is saying. I actually don't like this distinction that we end up drawing between theory on the one hand and data on the other hand.
It's all one.
In some ways, this is not it's a kind of it's an arbitrary distinction. We're trying to explain phenomenon. It needs to be phenomenon which actually real phenomenon we're trying to explain. That's the sense in which it's empirical.
I don't make this distinction between empirical and theory. Economists do, you know, there's the Journal of Economic Theory, there are economists walking around saying, I'm a theorist, and so on. The distinctions between the empirical and the non-empirical, that which we can perceive, measure, observe, etc., and that which we can't. We can't see gravity. We can see the falling leaf. We can know gravity through looking at the empirical. That's a distinction. You can't think without theory. There's no empirical without theory. The idea of falling is a theory. All observations are theory bound. Everything is theory. We theorize everything. But distinction is, and here I think Hamish and I agree, we have to assess theories, and we assess theories in terms of their empirical power, the explanatory power in terms of empirical, but the theories that are most important, the most generalizable, about the non-empirical. Things like social relations, rights, obligations, positions, and so on.
Yes, at the back.
I have two questions. For Dr. Lawson, do you believe economics can be a science? Do you think we should move away from like using the term schools of thought and talk about the toolkit more and start searching for a consensus of what's right and true? And for Professor Lowe, you talk about models and generalizability. Do you support models as a narrative and as a story, and then like, papers that basically move away in an estimated regression is not based on the theory they propose themselves, like a few pages back, or actually estimating the full structure?
Right, and this is great because we're going wider than the topic. If you look at every discipline in economics, if you look at biology, physics, chemistry, you name it, the disciplines are determined in the nature of the subject matter, the sort of principles that the subject matter follow. We divide up the world according to the sort of things there are. If we do that for the social realm, there's no reason to separate economics from anthropology, from politics, from the rest of it. There is just one social science. Certainly, I don't want to define it in terms of method. I talk about method because I'm critical of the emphasis on mathematical modeling in economics. But method is not the essence of anything. If we look ontologically, that is, when we look at the nature of stuff we deal with, there's just a basis for one social science. We all deal with the same stuff under a different aspect. But in physics and chemistry and biology, there are divisions of labour according to the types of questions asked. And so it can be in the social science. And there's a basis for a division of labour called economics, sociology, politics and anthropology. And within economics, we can have an even greater division of labour. Back to questions, I'm certainly into questions. The world is made up, the social world, I would argue, with relations. Within economics or social theory, those who look at the rationality of social life most are feminists. There's a division of labour. Feminists are particularly interested in relations of oppression and care and so on. Within economics, social reality is also in process. It's undergoing change, evolution, with some constancy all the time. That's traditionally been the concern of institutional economics. So a division of labour, institutionalists look at under the process of change. Openness, uncertainty can go to the post-Keynesians. The totality that is capitalism can go to the Marxists. What I'm saying is the schools of thought are basically divisions, or can be united as divisions of labour in one unified, total, bigger division of labour, it's economics, within one unified social science.
So I don't think that's the approach I would take or want to see taken, because that's an approach which puts questions into silos and allows particular people to answer those questions. Let me define a question. Is this a sociology question or is this an economics question? If we're trying to explain why do why have been such changes in, say, the rate at which women go back to work after having children, when we're trying to address that question, is that a sociology question or an economics question? The thing is, it doesn't actually matter. It's a phenomenon we see that as social science, we should be trying, as social scientists, we should be trying to explain. And so I think this kind of buttonholing or pushing particular questions to be addressed by particular theories, I just don't think that's what I would ever like economics to see. I think that's exactly what gets us into this kind of polarization of debate. About this question you're raising about the generalizability, I actually think the generalizability is at the heart of economics, and I think it's extremely difficult. So I spend my own research, a lot of what I would try to do is try to write down economic theories of behaviour and the way the government's involved in behaviour, and then explicitly take those to the data. And so that's a very kind of structural approach to how economics should be done. It's very much trying to tie in the theory of behaviour with what you're actually estimating. That's not to say it's the only way of addressing some of these questions. I think there's equally good papers where they are saying this is just an anecdote of what's going on, and that anecdote is consistent with what we see in the data. There's sometimes you can do one approach and sometimes do the other. I think that if we're in a kind of blanket world of saying this is one methodology fits all, then I think that's where we go wrong. I think we should be saying sometimes we can do this, sometimes we can do that. And we should try to be saying, how can we best answer this question? And the flip side of that is, I think we should also be honest that there's some questions we cannot answer. And you talk to policymakers, they want answers to questions, and sometimes you've got to say, actually, we cannot answer that question. Mm-hmm. I think one of the lessons I took from all the public discourse by economists through the Great Recession was the number of times you saw on debate, on television, journalists, economists making comments that ask questions that I know they cannot actually answer, but they still believe they have to give an answer. And I think that's what's really damaging to economics. And that's what generates, again, is back to this kind of spurious sort of precision, a spurious kind of quantification. It's answering something where you don't actually have the evidence to answer it or the ability to answer it. I think we need to be more honest about that.
Yeah, can I make a quick comment on the unification of different schools? I don't think they can ever be unified as one. I mean, my view is that they are more like different types of music. Jazz, classical, heavy metal, the electronic, you name it. I mean, yeah, they are all music, so in that sense there's some commonality. But simply because I don't know, Stravinsky borrowed some things from jazz doesn't mean that classical music and jazz have been unified. So I think it's actually useful to have these different ways of looking at the same thing, even within economics, not to speak of looking at the same phenomenon from sociological point of view and economic point of view, and also using interdisciplinary approach to work together. But I think it will be actually quite boring if all theories are unified into one theory.
I mean, what I mean is that schools of thought sort of evoke philosophy, and you have one group saying, oh, there is a God, and then another saying, there isn't a God. And I was saying, well, it's okay to disagree. How can that be a science?
Yeah, well, if you take that position, then yeah, obviously it's not a science.
I think that's a question we cannot answer. I think that's exactly.
Disagreement's not a sign of an absence of science. Einstein and Bohr disagreed for 25 years. It didn't mean they weren't scientists. Einstein never accepted quantum mechanics, but it doesn't mean he wasn't a scientist.
True, yeah.
I mean, disagreement is essential to progress in science.
But that's why I'm saying we should search for consensus rather than be like, well, let's agree to disagree.
Yeah, no, we should search for consensus, but the world keeps pulling us apart because we see it in different ways. But we're trying to agree.
Wonderful. I think we'll take 2 more questions, and unfortunately then we can wrap it up and move into the garden. So we'll do one and that.
If I may, just a couple of comments. I'm an outsider, an engineer and scientist, so probably say all the wrong things. But if you look at science, I think of the history of science, and I think of the man from this part of the world, James Clerk Maxwell. Now, he wasn't a theoretical man. I thought he was a mathematician who just sat in a chair and did maths. He spent most of his life experimenting, observing, asking questions, trying to drill down to the right question. And I think answering the question is the most important thing. But I don't agree it depends on your bias. I think if you really want to know something, you drill down to the right question. I've been reading books on economics for the last 4 years as an amateur and probably misunderstanding most of it. I noticed a lot of it pretty arcane, the terms aren't properly defined as a scientist originally would expect, and maybe that's natural based on the breadth and the scope of the subject. Another economist once quoted not long ago, I don't remember his name, but he just got a PhD in economics, and he said, economics is like a science, but it's like chemistry when it was at the level of alchemy. and that's not to be rude. I mean, obviously economics as a science, if it is, whatever it is, as a study, came later than these other more easier subjects like light and electromagnetism, which are easy compared to economics, I think. They took Maxwell a lifetime to even come to the last minute on his deathbed virtually. That's the equation. So science versus non-science, I think is fairly academic. The question in my 4 years of looking at this subject is, I start off with a really dumb question. Where does money come from? A really dumb question. I couldn't find an answer. I've looked and looked and looked. I've looked at Maynard Keynes, I've looked at Hayek, and threw his in the bin, I've looked everywhere. Actually, quite recently I looked at a book, and maybe you know about it and dismissed it, by Richard Werner from Southampton, which is Where Does Money Come From? At least I found some answers. 97% of our money is produced by commercial bankers who put numbers on a ledger. And that helped to answer the question, because I, as a scientist and engineer, always thought that money was created where the wealth was created. Somehow, never could see the link. So to me, that's a question that I need to answer to understand better the subject. Whether it's a science or not a science is really not the question. Anyway, observations rather than questions.
We'll just take the second question and then that's okay.
So I think that if you guys are going to say that economics is not a science, then I would encourage you all to make that very clear in your grant and funding applications. Because I don't know how it works here, but back in the United States, economics gets all this money because it has this sort of research money because of the guise of empirics and quantitative analysis. And Dimitri, when you talked about armchair conversations, you talked about empirics as people who are actually talking about reality, and as a historian who doesn't use numbers, well, maybe I do, but I do use some numbers, but I don't use mostly numbers in my work. I think that I would not be classified as someone who does empirics. And as if it's not empirical, historical analysis is not considered empirical. And as a result of that, the funding available to be a humanist or to be a historian is diminishing. So if you, whatever you want to call it, the science, empirical subject, can you explain why economics should get more funding as a research discipline than the humanities? Because that's the practical implication of this philosophical conversation.
Can I answer that? I think what's completely wrong about asking that sort of question. That's not the right question to be asking. The question you should be asking is, why does social science get so much less funding than the hard sciences? Because I think what we really do in the hard sciences is we look at it and we think, well, if you're putting money into medicine, it's about curing cancer. And that's not looking at what's the marginal benefit of money going into medicine, which I suspect is pretty close to zero. And I think that in economics and the social sciences across the board, you actually get pretty high returns at the margin for what you put in, because the amount of monies are so low. And I think what's going on in our debate when you ask this question is, here we are, we're fighting over the scraps of huge amounts of money going into research, where the marginal benefit is actually very small. And I do think, if I think about the shift in the US, that there is now, you can get economics funding through the NSF. You do get a lot of funding for economics, which you don't have in other aspects of social science. I think we should take that as a more positive thing than we are. And we should say, actually, at least money's being put into social sciences. Now, we can take it in a negative way of saying, it should go into other aspects of social science. I would actually take it in a more positive way and say, it's going into social science, it's going to address what are the key questions of society.
Yeah, but the question is simply, why is that as important or more important than historical inquiry, which is classified as somehow different? It's not like, when you say it's not empirical, you might, in your armchair conversation, you're implying that they weren't talking about the world that is, and actually, I'm talking about the world that is and the world that was, and the world that was before that.
I did not, and never would, claim that history is not an empirical subject.
Okay.
I mean, I think that there's quantifiable and empirical, and there's qualitative and empirical. I mean, and there's different ways, different degrees of quantification you can have. But just because something's qualitative and empirical doesn't mean it's not empirical.
But I think there is, something in what you're saying, because at least in the last couple of centuries, and probably increasingly more so, we have lived with this phenomenon of what I call science worship. Yeah? Science represented by sort of standard physics, yeah, in this case, and yeah, the closer you are to that, you are supposed to be cleverer, more correct, you know, more worthy, and so on. And yes, I mean it's an answer that only someone who studies sociology of knowledge can give. I mean, I don't have the competence to give answer to why that has been the case, but I think there definitely is that phenomenon. Yeah? So somehow you have to model yourself after physics, so that you would have a higher intellectual status, more funding, and so on.
I think if Hamish was answering one of the exam papers today, he'd start every question by saying this is the wrong question.
So I wouldn't do very well.
No, that's not how we get first in Cambridge.
I think there's no reason economics should get more money than history, and I think there's no reason economics and history should get less money than physics. I'm arguing we're all capable of doing. History is science. In history, the causal question is there as in any other discipline. I mean, after all, looking at the origins of the universe is history. This is good. I mean, everything's in time and space. There isn't an a priori reason to say this subject is more important than that subject, other than maybe it's like, well, a priori there's no reason. We may decide because of our values, we want a flourishing world of human beings, and so medical sciences may come first, but these questions need to be discussed, but a priori there isn't a reason. Certainly not because one is mathematical and one isn't. That shouldn't be a basis, though it is in fact the basis, and it is in fact the basis on which people get promoted or appointed to jobs in economics and so on, whether we like it or not. But still, the other thing I've learned about Hamish, he'll be supporting you in my attempts to put on non-mathematical courses in the economics faculty in the future. I agree with Hamish and Hajun. Questions, I mentioned, questions are so important, but questions aren't important in the abstract. I haven't talked about how we do economics or social theory differently if we don't use mathematical modelling, but I think the starting point is always from a surprise. In a sense, the second stage of the dialectic. We have an understanding, something happens to contradict our understanding, there's the question, there's the puzzle, and off we go to answer it. But what's puzzling is different for all of us, so we answer different questions. That's one of the main insights of feminist standpoint theory. We stand differently with different points of view. If I saw a flying cow, I'd be surprised. I think, what on earth is explained as the flying cow? If Hamish was a Martian just landed, he'd look and say, oh, cows fly. We start from a different perspective, and relative to current understandings, we're surprised in different ways. When I have a symptom of the illness, I'm surprised by it, but I'm pretty ignorant. Some of the questions I ask are pretty naive. If I go to a medical expert, they ask different sorts of questions because they recognize things immediately that I don't take for granted. Questions are important, but it's the fact that we all are situated differently is an argument for democracy, for inclusiveness in the process. I want to call it the scientific progress, because we all come from different areas, different backgrounds, different points of views, different experiences, and so on. The last question on money, if it was the last question, I don't know if anyone knows anything about me here, but what I work on is something called ontology. It's the nature of being, the nature of stuff. My essential message is we need to bring ontology back into social theory, most especially economics. They do it in physics all the time. They ask the question, what do we mean when we talk about particles, waves, quarks, space-time, dark matter? These are all questions in ontology. We don't do it in economics. We can't ask questions like, where does money come from? Until we answer the question, what is money? Economists haven't a clue what money is. They haven't a clue what the corporation is. They haven't a clue what gender is, what technology is, what society is, what the economy is. They haven't a clue about most of the things they deal with. Their y is a function to x1 to xn. Some of them even argue that x1 to xn can be anything and nothing. We have to start upping our game. And one of the many ways we have and need to up our game is to start questioning, what are we dealing with? What do we mean by social agents? What do we mean by money? What do we mean by the corporation? What do we mean by gender? What do we mean by morality, ethics, human flourishing, the good society? And then we can start asking interesting questions which will make economics too much better as well as just a science.
Can I just interrupt one? Wait, my last word. In some ways, I kind of think what's comes out of a lot of this, and what's come out of the recent debate of the last 5-6 years about what's been happening with economics is it's actually a much more positive message, which is how much economics has got to answer. The reason why there's this debate about economics is because it does address things which are of first order importance across society. And I think what we want to make sure we do is that we don't lose sight of what we actually agree on and what we actually understand in thinking about this kind of polarized way in which we think about things. We could discuss where money comes from, and I can give you an answer and so on, but I think the heart of it is there are things which we actually agree on. And I think that one thing economists are extremely bad at is PR. And we're extremely bad actually focusing on what we agree on, what we can say, what we can actually use to understand the world. And so I kind of take a much more positive view about where we are than, say, Tony, who thinks we don't know much at all, which is there are things we know. But what we do is we're very public and we're very polarized in the way we disagree. And that gives us impression that we don't actually agree about anything. And I think it'd be surprising how much we do agree about and how much that would actually help political debate.
Wonderful. Well, I think we all have had and enjoyed a fantastic and varied and large debate about the question, about what it is to be the question and what it should have been. But hopefully it's been one that people have enjoyed. And so before we give a big round of applause for all the speakers for coming, just like to thank you all for coming as well as the speakers. And then after this discussion, we can continue on to the gardens with quiche and the rest of the drinks as the sun comes out. So just a big round of applause for the speakers.